Jonathan had barely lowered his small suitcase toward the space beneath the seat when the boarding pass was ripped straight out of his hand. A soft, tearing sound followed short, sharp, cold, as a blade slicing through the air. Amber Collins looked at him, the way someone might look at a man who had stepped into a place he had no right to be. "Stand up," she said, her voice stripped of emotion, courtesy, or anything resembling professionalism, leaving only hollow authority and a set of fanged prejudices. Linda froze in the first-class cabin, the harsh white light from the ceiling fixtures washing over her face, draining its color. Jonathan stood perfectly still, silent. But it was not a silence of weakness. It carried weight like heated steel. He bent down, picked up the half of the torn ticket lying on the floor, and stared at the seat number, still printed clearly on it. Seat 2A, first class, the seat he had paid for the seat that belonged to him. Amber gave a thin, taunting smile. "There has been a seat change. You two will be moved to Economy Plus." Her voice was coated in sugar, yet pointed like a needle. Jonathan looked straight into her eyes without speaking. Some truths do not need words. They only need a single look sharp enough to slap an entire rotting system across the face. From the front of the cabin, shouting erupted. Jeffrey and Melissa Carter were arguing loudly with Supervisor Derek Hansen. When Jeffrey saw Amber blocking Jonathan's path, he glanced at the older man and let out a mocking laugh. "Told you so." Obvious case of someone sitting in the wrong place. Murmurs spread through the cabin like ripples across still water. Some passengers looked away, others stared directly, but every single one of them knew exactly what was happening. They simply wanted no part in it. Jonathan inhaled slowly, a long breath to steady the anger rising inside him like a tide. He held out the remaining half of the ticket. "My seat." Derek glanced at it without interest. No inspection, no verification. They had already made their decision long before they walked over. Linda placed a trembling hand against her chest, her breathing turning uneven. Jonathan turned toward his wife. "Are you all right?" But Derek's eyes did not look at Linda, did not acknowledge the visible distress on her face, did not see the exhaustion tightening with every breath. He only turned to Jeffrey with a smile Jonathan had not received from anyone here. The smile of someone who believed one life held more value than another. "Mr. Carter, we will handle this immediately." Jeffrey stepped forward, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with his signature arrogance. "Listen, people like you understand how things work," he said. After a pause, he lowered his voice and smirked. "Know your place." Linda let out a faint sound. Jonathan did not move. His eyes shifted, growing sharper, shifting from restraint into warning. He spoke each word falling heavy like a hammer striking steel. "I paid for this seat, and I will sit here." The air in the first-class cabin thickened like glue. Avoidant glances, judging glances, glances full of fear of getting involved. Not a single voice rose in support. Silence settled like poisonous dust over every row. At the back of the cabin, young flight attendant Tiana Hughes stood frozen. She saw everything, every gesture, every look, every word, each layer of discrimination laid bare beneath the cold fluorescent lights. She wanted to speak, but she knew the price. She had seen colleagues lose their jobs for saying one truthful sentence to the wrong person. Linda's breathing worsened her chest, rising and falling irregularly. Jonathan saw it immediately, the early signal of a potential heart attack. He turned back to Derek. "My wife needs to stay seated, right now." Derek folded his arms, icy and unmoved. If you cooperate, everything will go faster." Amber stood beside him with a cruel smile. "Don't make this difficult." Jonathan looked at them both, and something in his eyes made Amber step back half a pace. It was anger, not loud or explosive, but honed by decades of endurance, sharp and disciplined. His voice dropped lower, but each syllable sliced clean through the wall of prejudice closing in on him. "You are removing the wrong person." For a moment, every sound in the cabin seemed to halt. A few passengers lifted their phones. Others swallowed hard, sensing they were about to witness something far beyond a simple seat dispute. Derek delivered his order with counterfeit authority. "Call security." Amber touched her radio, her lips curling. "Front cabin, calling security. Non-compliant passenger, requesting forced removal." Jonathan stood firm. No retreat. No shake. No fear. Linda gasped, one hand gripping her chest. Behind them, Tiana's hands tightened until her knuckles turned white, her eyes dark with dread and heartbreak. Jonathan looked from Derek to Amber, then to Jeffrey, and delivered the final sentence before that night shattered the truth behind an entire airline. "You don't know what you have just done." The cabin seemed to dim. The air thickened, pressing inward. A storm was about to erupt, and none of them had the slightest idea that they had just provoked the worst possible person to provoke on that entire flight. Jonathan stood motionless in the center of the cabin, while Amber's security call echoed in the air like a fire alarm. But the real storm wasn't at the aircraft door. It was erupting inside Linda's chest. She clutched her heart, her fingertips trembling uncontrollably. Her breaths came short, deep and broken. Jonathan recognized it instantly. This was not ordinary panic. This was something he had witnessed hundreds of times on the operating table, but never on the body of his own wife. Jonathan, her voice, was thin, fragile, ready to snap. The cabin lights suddenly felt too bright, too cold. A few passengers saw her sink slightly against the seat, but they held tight to the safe silence of bystanders, the kind who stayed out of trouble as long as the trouble wasn't theirs. No one moved. No one asked. No one dared interfere with the injustice spreading like a dark stain through first class. Jonathan wrapped an arm around Linda. His voice pulled tight like steel wire. "She needs to stay still. She needs oxygen. She needs to be monitored immediately." Amber crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow in mocking amusement. "You can take her down to the lower cabin. There is more space there." Tiana stood a few steps away, as if held in place by invisible restraints. She knew this had gone far beyond what was acceptable. But Derek stood right in front of her, his eyes firing a silent warning that even a single word of objection could end her career on the spot. Jeffrey let out another dry laugh, stepped closer, and lowered his voice. "If you cooperate, your wife will be fine. Don't make this hard on everyone." But every word was a knife carving into Jonathan's gut. Cooperate. Cooperate in exchange for humiliation. Cooperate so his wife could be squeezed into the lower cabin for 12 hours while having a potential heart attack. Jonathan tightened his grip around Linda's hand, then fixed his gaze on Jeffrey. That look made the man freeze, as if he had just locked eyes with a cornered lion. "You have no authority to make decisions about her health." Jonathan's voice was low and cold, but deep and sharp like striking metal. Derek stepped in, tilting his head, as if speaking to a child. "Mr. Brooks, if you don't comply, security will enter, and things will get worse." Jonathan stared at him without blinking. "You are the one making things worse, not me." Linda's breathing grew more strained. Her chest pulled tight, her shoulders trembled as she fought to push air through a chest that was closing in on itself. The mental camera zoomed in on her eyes, wide with fear, pain and silent pleading. Jonathan braced himself against the seat, his voice snapping out like a command. "I need aspirin. I need the medical kit. Now." Amber narrowed her eyes. "You are not a doctor." Jonathan turned fully toward her, holding back his fury with the iron discipline forged through 30 years in emergency rooms. "I am a cardiologist at the Chicago Medical Center. And if you don't bring the equipment, my wife could go into cardiac arrest on this aircraft." The sentence hit like gasoline thrown onto an open flame. Amber's face faltered for a split second, but she masked it quickly. "I will check again." No, Jonathan cut her off. "You have checked enough. Bring the medical kit now." Tiana swallowed hard, her heart hammering. She knew Jonathan was telling the truth. She could see the fear draining the color from his face, not fear for himself, but for Linda. It was the face of a husband watching the person he loved slip out of his grasp, while no one around them was willing to help. Tiana took half a step forward, small but enough for Jonathan to notice she wanted to help. Derek spun around, eyes blazing. "Hughes, out of line. Step back." Tiana froze, shoulders tightening with helpless frustration. Linda clutched Jonathan's hand. "I'm not okay." Jonathan pressed his forehead gently against hers, his voice trembling for the first time since the entire ordeal began. "I'm here. I won't let anyone touch you." And right then, heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. 3 security officers entered their faces, stern hands resting near their radios and belts. A wave of whispers washed across the cabin. They really called security because of him. But his wife is about to faint. Jeffrey stepped back, arms crossed, satisfaction glowing on his face. Amber tried to hide her victorious smile behind a mask of professionalism. Derek positioned himself in front of Jonathan, his voice booming with artificial authority. "Mr. Brooks, security is here. If you do not leave your seat immediately, they will remove you by force." Jonathan looked around, at the passengers burying their faces in their phones, at the eyes that refused to meet his, at the people choosing comfort over justice. Then he looked at Linda, the only person he could not afford to lose. He turned to Derek, his voice low like thunder trapped above the clouds. "I hope you understand the consequences of this." Derek lifted his chin. "I am following procedure." Jonathan nodded slightly, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. "Very well," he said, slowly, dangerously. "Proceed." Security stepped forward. Linda gasped softly, her hands shaking, her breath quickening. Tiana covered her mouth, eyes burning red. Jonathan rose slowly, lifting Linda into his arms. No resistance, no struggle, no shouting. His silence chilled the entire cabin. As soon as they began to walk past the rows, Jonathan turned his head back, letting his stare sweep over every face that had chosen to watch instead of act. Then he spoke not loud, but with a tone sharp enough to slice through the frozen air. "You will regret this." The mental camera moved in slow motion, following each step as Jonathan guided Linda out of first class. The cold white cabin lights dimmed around them. Linda's breaths weakened with every movement. The moment the cabin door closed behind them, the story shifted. From injustice to open war, from personal humiliation to a coming societal reckoning. And none of them knew that the man they had just forced off the plane was the last person they should ever have crossed. Jonathan guided Linda out of the aircraft cabin, his footsteps heavy as lead. The stark white light of the jet bridge poured down on them, so bright, it was blinding, so bright, it exposed every layer of humiliation weighing on his shoulders. Linda clung to his arm, her breath broken and shallow, the collar of her blouse damp with sweat. Behind them, the echo of the security officer's footsteps followed steady and cold. No one spoke. None of them understood that every forced step pushing this man off the aircraft would eventually shake the entire aviation system to its core. But their silence had already become a verdict against themselves. The moment they reached the terminal floor, Linda's knees buckled and her hand slipped off the metal railing. Jonathan caught her instantly, his voice dropping to its lowest tight as a string about to snap. "Linda, look at me. Breathe." She tried, but each breath was a twisting blade in her chest. Jonathan eased her into a chair, both hands framing her face. "Listen to me. You are showing signs of cardiac ischemia. You need to keep your breathing steady." But Linda only shook her head, her lips trembling, her eyes blurring. "Jonathan, my heart, it hurts." Panic clawed at him, but the discipline of a doctor held him together. A part of him wanted to scream at everyone who had shoved them to this point, but the stronger part focused only on her breathing, on the seconds that mattered most. Jonathan spun around, shouting into the open space medical personnel. Immediately, a young airport staff member rushed over, uncertain and nervous. "Sir, I've called medical support, but it might take a few minutes. She does not have a few minutes." Jonathan snapped his voice, restrained but forceful. "I am a cardiologist. She is heading toward a myocardial infarction. I need aspirin, an automated external defibrillator, and a wheelchair now." But in the staff member's eyes, he saw doubt not toward his expertise, but toward who he was and what he looked like. That filthy skepticism ingrained in the foundations of society. Jonathan recognized it. He had seen it his entire life. There was no time for anger. He grabbed the radio from her hand. "This is Dr. Jonathan Brooks. I am at Gate Foxtrot 12. A 58-year-old female is presenting with chest pain, shortness of breath, cold extremities, and radiating pain down the left arm. Preliminary assessment is an acute myocardial infarction. Request immediate assistance." His voice carried so sharply that everyone within several yards turned to look. It was not the voice of a passenger. It was the voice of a doctor, accustomed to giving orders when a life was hanging by a thread. The security officers exchanged glances. Moments earlier, they were ready to drag him off the plane like a disruptive threat. Now they realized the man they had pushed out was not the kind they assumed. Jonathan knelt beside Linda, checking her pulse. Rapid and irregular. "Linda, listen to me. Stay with me. Look at me." Linda squinted, struggling to stay conscious. "Jonathan, please don't leave. I'm scared." He rested his hand gently on her cheek, his voice soft for a moment. But under that softness burned a rising fury. "I'm here! I'm not going anywhere!" An automated external defibrillator finally arrived. Jonathan opened the box, checking it quickly. Seal intact. Good. He placed the pads on her chest, his hands trembling slightly but never losing control. The machine powered on and began analyzing her rhythm. Jonathan glanced at the screen, and his own heart skipped. ST elevation, damn it! He turned and shouted, "Someone get aspirin, now!" Another staff member sprinted forward with a box of medication, hands shaking. Jonathan placed the tablet under Linda's tongue himself. His eyes reddened, not with tears but with fury, caught behind his throat. Behind them, the sharp sound of high heels echoed. Amber Collins appeared at the jet bridge entrance, her expression still blank. But when she saw Linda lying on the floor, trembling wires connected to the automated external defibrillator across her chest, Amber's face drained of color. Moments later, Derek Hanson arrived. He stood with crossed arms, his expression unreadable, but his posture dripping with avoidance. Jonathan saw him, and in Jonathan's eyes was something Derek had never faced, the gaze of a man pushed to the breaking point who would never forgive this. Linda trembled harder. Jonathan leaned close to her. "Stay with me, we're getting out of here. Do not fall asleep." But her eyelids drooped as if surrendering. Jonathan shook his head, his voice exploding into a low roar. "Linda, do not sleep. Keep your eyes open for me." The shout froze everyone around them. No one had ever heard a doctor lose composure like that. But this was not just a patient. This was his wife. At that moment, the wail of a medical siren pierced the air. 2 paramedics rushed over with a stretcher. Jonathan rose instantly, delivering a rapid, precise report like a military command. Female 58 chest pain, ST elevation, shortness of breath, cold extremities, radiating pain down the left arm. Suspected left anterior descending artery occlusion. One paramedic looked at him. "Are you a doctor?" Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Cardiologist. More than 30 years of experience." Any hesitation vanished from their faces. "Understood. We'll take over." Linda was lifted onto the stretcher. Jonathan never released her hand. Amber stepped aside. Derek stepped back. They both avoided Jonathan's eyes like people avoiding the sun in winter. As the stretcher turned toward the main hallway, Jonathan glanced back at them. One look, enough to make both drop their gaze. He said nothing, but his silence made their skin crawl long after. The path to the ambulance felt endless. Jonathan stayed beside her, holding her hand tightly. She opened her eyes briefly, whispering, "Jonathan, I'm sorry for causing trouble." His throat tightened, but his voice was hard as steel. "You did nothing wrong. They are the ones at fault." The ambulance doors closed. Red and blue lights washed over Jonathan's face, the face of a man who had lost all faith in justice, yet was preparing for the greatest battle of his life. The siren screamed through the air, through Jonathan's chest, through the storm rising inside him. In the next 20 minutes, everything blurred like a whirlwind. Linda was rushed straight into cardiac intervention. Jonathan stood outside the emergency room, gripping the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. In that brief window of time, he looked at his phone, flooded with messages, flooded with videos, flooded with outrage from the internet. The clip of him being escorted off the plane had gone viral. No one knew that the so-called disruptive passenger was now standing here, waiting to hear whether his wife would live. Jonathan turned away, pressing a hand to the wall, eyes shut tight. He whispered, his voice low, as a growl, "I swear this will not end here." When the emergency room doors swung open and the doctor stepped out with a nod, Linda was stable out of immediate danger. Jonathan exhaled in relief. But deep in his eyes, something far more dangerous than any heart attack was taking form. An awakening, a fire, a declaration of war. And as he stood up straight and leaned down to kiss Linda's forehead, everything inside Jonathan Brooks had changed. He was no longer just a doctor, no longer just a husband, no longer just a victim. He would become the storm that airline never imagined they would have to face. The hospital was washed in a weary white glow, as Jonathan leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the phone screen that had just lit up with a message from Calvin. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what it said. The video from the plane had blown up. Literally. A passenger had recorded everything: Amber tearing his ticket, Derek threatening him, Jeffrey sneering, "Know your place," security escorting him out like a criminal, while Linda was moments from collapsing. The 3-minute clip had already surpassed 2 million views within a few hours. Social media headlines exploded like fireworks. Black passenger removed from first class without cause, GlobalStar accused of racial discrimination, wife suffers heart attack after forced removal. Jonathan stared at the screen, feeling as though he were looking at someone else, another man being dragged, surrounded by bias, treated as if he had no worth. But that man was him. And the world had now seen what the airline never wanted exposed. Calvin called. Jonathan answered. "Are you holding up?" Calvin's voice wasn't soft or comforting. It was sharp, direct, the voice of someone who understood. Jonathan didn't need soothing, he needed direction. "Linda is in recovery," Jonathan said, breath heavy but tone still controlled. "But I know everything." Calvin cut in. "I saw the video." "Jonathan, this isn't an incident. This is an explosion." Jonathan looked at the recovery room door. He didn't want to leave Linda, but he knew this was no longer just his personal battle. GlobalStar released a statement. Calvin continued, dripping with contempt. "They're calling you a disruptive passenger. They say you refused safety instructions. They say they removed you to protect the flight." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. "Safety? When my wife nearly died right in front of them, it doesn't matter what they say," Calvin replied. "What matters is the video exposed them. And now they're scared. Do you understand? They are afraid of you." Jonathan closed his eyes. The words hit him hard. For his whole life, he had let his calm resolve everything. He had avoided conflict. He had avoided escalation. But this time, they had escalated it. They had touched Linda. They had forced his wife off a plane while she was having a heart attack. "Calvin," Jonathan said quietly, steel in his voice, "we begin. I'll be at the hospital in 1 hour. Get ready. This will be the fight of your life." As soon as he hung up, a new message appeared from an unknown number. "I am one of the flight attendants from the flight. I saw everything. I'm willing to testify." Jonathan looked at the sender's name, Tiana Hughes. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling a surge of electricity run down his spine. Not everyone on that flight had stayed silent. Not everyone accepted injustice as part of the job. Jonathan called. Tiana answered immediately. "Dr. Brooks, I'm sorry No," Jonathan interrupted. "You did nothing wrong. Thank you for speaking up." Tiana's voice wavered. "You need to know this happens often. This wasn't the first time, but this time I couldn't stay quiet." "They removed the wrong person," Jonathan said. Tiana exhaled shakily. "I know." After the call ended, Jonathan stood still for a long time. He could feel the shift in the air, the axis of the story tilting, and for the first time since leaving the plane, he no longer felt pushed back. He was moving forward. Calvin arrived as promised, black suit eyes sharp as blades. They sat in the waiting lounge, surrounded by the sound of doctors' footsteps and the distant beeping of monitors. Calvin opened his laptop. "Here," he said, turning the screen toward Jonathan. "The airline is hiding something. But I've got an internal source. They have special instructions for passengers like Carter. Absolute priority." Jonathan read the leaked emails, vague but unmistakable. Prioritize high-value guests, adjust seating, as needed, handle premium clients, with elevated discretion. Discretion, Jonathan laughed bitterly. That's systematic discrimination. Exactly. And we're going to prove it. Calvin opened another window, revealing messages from multiple GlobalStar employees, anonymous but telling the same story. Move seats based on perception check tickets of black passengers, extra carefully reassigned seats to protect the premium experience. A cold chill ran down Jonathan's spine. It hadn't been one hateful employee, not one isolated act. This was structure. This was system. This was machinery. Calvin looked at him, voice low but firm. You want to sue them for discrimination? Good. But I'll tell you now, this won't stop at civil court. We can trigger a full federal investigation. GlobalStar will never be the same. Jonathan lifted his eyes to Calvin. The humiliation was gone. What replaced it was resolve. They chose the wrong person. I won't stop. The recovery room door opened, the doctor calling them inside. Jonathan stood by Linda's bed, holding her hand. She was weak but awake. Jonathan, she whispered. He leaned close. I'm here. If this costs you your job, your reputation. Jonathan shook his head. Nothing matters more than you. Linda tried to smile, tears sliding down her face. No, don't stop. They need to be held responsible. Not just for us. For the people who don't have a voice. Jonathan looked into her eyes, the eyes of the woman who had stood by him for more than 35 years. Eyes that knew his every wound, his every quiet compromise. And she was the one telling him enough. Jonathan squeezed her hand, his voice low, firm as stone. I will never back down. When Jonathan stepped into the hallway again, reporters were already packed outside the hospital entrance, flashes firing at him like lightning. Microphones rose, questions hurled at him. Mr. Brooks, the airline says you were disruptive. Did you really attack a white passenger? They claim you refused to cooperate. Did your wife suffer a heart attack after being removed from the plane? Jonathan stood tall. The wind from the automatic doors brushed against his coat. He did not look away. He did not bow his head. He did not blink. He spoke slowly, clearly, coldly, cutting through the noise like a blade. They removed the wrong person. They endangered my wife's life, and they will be held accountable. The reporters fell silent for half a beat. Jonathan continued, his voice slamming down like a hammer. I am not only suing for my wife. I am suing for everyone who has ever been told they do not deserve a seat up front. I am suing for those who do not have a voice to shout back. I am suing for those who have been forced into silence. And I will take this to the end. Behind him, Calvin smiled faintly, the smile of a lawyer who knows he is standing beside a man who cannot be broken. Jonathan turned, walking past the crowd, each step heavy yet solid as anchors driven into the ground. And in that moment, everyone understood the battle had begun. A battle that would not only shake one airline, it would shake the entire system. Jonathan stood in the small hospital conference room, while Calvin spread out a series of documents, internal emails, and anonymous notes from GlobalStar employees across the table. The air was thick, heavy like molten metal. Every sheet of paper was a blade, slicing through the polished professional facade the airline had worn for years. But on the other side of all this, the company was already preparing to strike back. Jonathan could feel the pressure gathering like a wave about to crash. Calvin's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and frowned. They responded. Jonathan straightened his eyes, darkening as if preparing for a critical operation. Calvin switched to speaker. The voice of GlobalStar's legal representative filled the room, cold and slick like oil. We demand that Mr. Brooks immediately cease spreading false information. We will be releasing a report proving he was the disruptive party responsible for delaying the flight and threatening another passenger. Jonathan let out a short laugh, humorless and sharp. Calvin spoke quietly. They're starting to rewrite the story. They weren't just rewriting it. They were rebuilding the entire narrative the way they wanted it told. GlobalStar wasn't a small airline. They had a massive public relations team, ties to politicians, an entire media machine ready to twist the narrative into one where the victim always loses. And as if to prove it, an emergency statement from the airline appeared on every platform within minutes. Calvin opened the newest official video. A white background, carefully crafted phrasing, "GlobalStar Airlines is committed to respecting all passengers." In the recent incident in Paris, a passenger named Jonathan Brooks refused to comply with crew instructions, disrupted the boarding process, and displayed threatening behavior toward staff. Jonathan's shoulders tightened. Not from shock, not from anger, from certainty. Certainty that this fight was no longer a simple lawsuit. Calvin glanced at him. This is just the beginning. Wait for their CEO. As if on cue, a breaking news alert flashed across the television mounted on the wall. The screen switched to a live press conference at GlobalStar headquarters in New York. CEO Edward Dawson stepped up to the podium, silver hair, immaculate navy suit, crisp presence, cold and commanding. Jonathan moved closer to the screen, his eyes locked. Dawson spoke with a deep, confident tone designed to shape public perception. We have reviewed the incident at Charles de Gaulle Airport. We confirm that the crew acted according to established procedure. We regret that passenger Brooks became agitated and acted inappropriately, requiring security intervention. The air in the room compressed into a steel block. Agitated, inappropriate, while Linda was on the verge of a heart attack. While he was fighting to save her life, Calvin scribbled notes like building a prosecution. They're painting you as the threat, a non-compliant black man. The classic script. Dawson continued, offering no apology at all. We acknowledge that online videos can be misleading. They do not reflect the full context. We stand by our employees and will protect their integrity. In that moment, Jonathan understood. Dawson wasn't just dodging responsibility. He was fortifying a wall. Every word defended a system that had been quietly discriminatory for decades. Calvin tapped his pen hard against the table. He's signaling to the entire industry. If he wins this, every other airline will use it as precedent. Jonathan took a deep breath. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with resolve. We bring him down with evidence. Calvin opened his laptop again, voice sharp as steel. Today they fired back. Tomorrow we strike. At that moment, Jonathan's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. On the other end, a trembling but determined voice spoke. "My name is Amanda Wilkes. I used to work in customer prioritization at GlobalStar." Calvin immediately motioned for Jonathan to put her on speaker. Amanda continued, "I know what they did to you, and I know they've done it to many others. They choose who gets upgraded, who gets downgraded, not by rules, by perception." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. What kind of perception? Her voice cracked, heavy with the weight of truth finally spoken. Perception of who belongs in first class, white, wealthy, American, People of color, immigrants, they get extra checks, or they get moved. A dangerous silence filled the room. Calvin asked, "Do you have documents or emails?" "Yes. And I'm willing to turn everything over. I quit because I couldn't take it anymore." Jonathan said softly, "Thank you." Amanda answered, "No." "Thank you. You're the first person they couldn't bury." When the call ended, Jonathan stood at the window. Snow was falling gently over Paris lights, dancing across the icy streets. He could feel something shifting inside himself. This was no longer personal anger, no longer just the pain he and Linda suffered. This had become a test of an industry's morality, a test of a society's conscience. Calvin closed his laptop and stood. "It's time for phase 2. I'll release a press statement. But what you need to prepare is your declaration." "Declaration?" Jonathan asked. "Yes." "Dawson just addressed the world. Now it's your turn." Jonathan nodded slowly, not because he needed convincing, but because he already knew what he had to do. Calvin handed him a draft. Jonathan didn't look at it. He spoke instead calm and precise without rehearsal. "We tell them the truth. No polish. No fear. No retreat." Calvin stared at him like a blade being sharpened. "Exactly. You won't apologize. You won't justify. You say 3 things: they discriminated, they lied, and they nearly killed your wife." Jonathan responded, "And I won't stop until they face what they've done." Calvin smiled for the first time that day. That's what scares them most. Jonathan returned to Linda's bedside. She slept peacefully now, her breathing steady. He placed his hand over hers. "My love, they have no idea what they've awakened." Outside, the snow fell thicker. At GlobalStar headquarters, Dawson basked in the cameras. In the hospital, Jonathan prepared his counterstrike. One side was a system built on protected power. The other was a man who had lost faith in that system, but found a reason to fight. And only one side would remain standing when the truth came to light. Jonathan sat beside Linda's hospital bed when his phone buzzed again. A bright red notification flashed across the screen. GlobalStar to hold second emergency press conference. 2 major press releases in just a few hours. That meant only one thing: they were terrified. Calvin entered with a fresh stack of documents, his expression tense, but his eyes razor-sharp. They're mobilizing everything they have. Legal, public relations, crisis communication. They're preparing a full counterattack. Jonathan looked at Linda, still asleep, her breathing steadier now. He stood, squeezed her hand gently, then turned back to face the war unfolding outside that room. Calvin opened his laptop and turned the screen toward him. "This is what we're up against." On the screen played the latest video from CEO Dawson. He stared straight into the camera with even more confidence than before, his tone firm and contrived. "We have evidence that Mr. Brooks physically shoved one of our employees, causing injury and disrupting aircraft operations. We will be cooperating with law enforcement to protect the integrity and safety of the aviation industry." Jonathan felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from pure distilled fury. Calvin clenched his jaw. "They want to turn you into a public menace, a dangerous black man. The same stereotype they've been weaponizing for a century." Jonathan didn't look away from the screen. Every lie Dawson delivered slid out smoothly like oil, spreading across water, sealing over every trace of truth. The system knew how to protect itself. But Calvin's lips curled into a thin smile. "We haven't fired a single shot yet. They've already thrown 3. Asymmetrical warfare. The weaker side always strikes fast. The stronger side waits for the perfect moment." Jonathan sat down slowly, his gaze deep and cold. Tell me, he asked, has our moment come? Calvin placed a small USB drive on the table. This is proof they knew your wife was in danger long before calling security, and they deliberately ignored it. Jonathan stared at the tiny device, heavy as stone. What's on it? Internal audio, Calvin replied. A flight attendant leaked it. They're scared, that's why it came so fast. Calvin plugged it in. A sound file appeared on screen. He pressed play. Amber's voice came first. She's complaining about chest pain, but Brooks is being too difficult. Then Derek's voice followed. Forget it. Call security. We're not giving up a seat for someone like that. Jonathan felt something grab his heart and squeeze hard. It wasn't pain, it wasn't shock. It was confirmation. Confirmation of what he had known deep inside all along. They had never seen him as a passenger or a doctor or even a human being. They saw him as something to move aside. Calvin stopped the audio. We'll use this. Just not yet. Jonathan turned to him. I want to release it now. Calvin shook his head. No. They'll claim it's edited. We wait until the moment they least expect. Jonathan braced his hands on the table. What if Linda had died? What if she didn't make it? Calvin remained silent for a long moment. He looked at Jonathan the way a commander looks at a soldier who is cracked but not broken. Jonathan, she's alive. She's fighting. So are you. Jonathan closed his eyes. For the first time, his voice sank low, heavy as the bottom of a lake. I have saved thousands of hearts. I've operated through nights, through blizzards with shaking hands, after 20 hours on my feet. But I never imagined the person I'd have to save would be my wife because of an airline's actions. Calvin stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort, but the way one warrior steadies another. And that is exactly why we're going to win. Jonathan's phone vibrated again. An email notification. We need to talk. I have proof. Tiana Hughes. Calvin leaned in to read. She's ready to go public. Jonathan asked quietly. Is she sure she'll lose her job? Calvin answered. She knows. But she wants, for once in her life, to see justice stand on the right side. Jonathan sank into his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. Not from exhaustion, from the weight of what was coming. The blow they were preparing would not merely shake GlobalStar, it would tear out the rotten foundation everyone had ignored for decades. Calvin received another email, anonymous. He opened it. A leaked security video appeared Jeffrey Carter speaking to the gate agent. I don't want to sit next to certain types of passengers. You understand me, the gate agent responded softly. Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll take care of it. Calvin looked at Jonathan. Jonathan stared back. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Jonathan said with the tone he used before making the first incision in an operating room, We have a chance to change the entire industry. Calvin nodded. Yes, and they will do everything they can to kill that chance before it grows. Jonathan walked into the hospital hallway. The LED lights cast sharp lines across his face, outlining every hardened feature, every crease earned through years of restraint. He looked out the window at the falling Paris snow, soft flakes landing on the ground outside. In that quiet moment, he felt the justice of an entire society standing still, waiting for someone to push it back toward truth. From the waiting room behind him, the hospital TV echoed Dawson's voice, repeating the same lies again. But this time, Jonathan did not look at him as a victim. He looked at him as the man he was about to pull off his pedestal. In that instant, Jonathan knew. If the airline chose to fight with power, he would fight with truth. If they used lies to bury wrongdoing, he would expose them with evidence. If they built a system designed to discriminate, he would dismantle it with the same hands that had saved thousands of lives. Jonathan turned and walked back toward Linda's room, each step heavy, deliberate, like striking a hammer against stone. The battle had changed color. It was no longer defensive. Jonathan Brooks' doctor husband, the man whose boarding pass had been torn, had become the center of a war larger than himself, a war against a system, a war to reclaim dignity, a war to shatter decades of silence. And GlobalStar still had no idea they were not facing a passenger. They were facing a storm. Jonathan woke the next morning to the pale hospital light filtering through the curtains. Linda was still lying there, her complexion a little better, but her breathing still thin as a thread. His heart tightened every time he looked at her. He placed his hand gently over hers, silently vowing that everything that happened yesterday would not be buried under injustice. The door opened. Calvin stepped in. His face carried the sharp edges of a sleepless night. But his eyes were bright, the brightness of someone holding a card the enemy didn't know existed. Today they begin the legal war. Jonathan rose to his feet. Then so do we. Calvin placed a thick stack of files on the bedside table. I received 3 more internal testimonies last night. One from a flight attendant who was suspended for protesting the white passenger priority policy. 2 from office workers who received those special directive emails. And Calvin paused one from someone who worked directly with CEO Dawson. Jonathan glanced at him. And what did they say? Calvin opened the file. They said Dawson knew for years that the policy was controversial, but he kept it anyway. Because of profit. Because of the relationships with their VIP clients. He narrowed his eyes. And because Carter is a major financial backer for a new route expansion program. Jonathan clenched his jaw. Reap what you sow. But Calvin raised a hand. We're not releasing that yet. Not now. Jonathan exhaled, frustrated. You always make me wait. Calvin allowed a faint smile. I'm a lawyer. My job is to make the truth explode at the right moment in the right place, in the right way. The television outside the room echoed down the hall. A reporter stood in front of GlobalStar headquarters in New York, a line of security personnel behind her. CEO Dawson has announced the airline will file a countersuit accusing Dr. Brooks of deliberately provoking the situation and disrupting safety procedures. Jonathan froze. Calvin stepped beside him, voice dropping low like a blade slicing through earth. They're playing dirty, attacking your reputation. They want to exhaust you, scatter your focus, destroy your credibility before the lawsuit even begins. Jonathan stared toward the hallway. They chose the right strategy, but the wrong opponent. At that moment, Jonathan's phone rang. The voice was familiar. Jonathan, it's me, Warren Mitchell. Jonathan frowned. The attorney who recorded the video on the plane. Yes, I've got something big. Jonathan put the call on speaker. Calvin moved closer. Jonathan Warren said quickly, as if every second mattered, I received a leaked copy of the airline's original security report, the unedited version. Calvin's eyes widened. Unedited. Yes. In the original, they admit Linda showed signs of chest pain before security was ever called, and they still ordered both of you off. Jonathan felt heat flood his face. And they deleted that when they released the public version. Not only that, Warren continued lowering his voice, The original report states that security was called at the request of VIP passenger Carter, not because of any supposed safety threat. Both Jonathan and Calvin fell silent. Calvin whispered, "They just stepped on their own landmine." Warren added, "I also have hallway camera footage. It shows Carter talking to Derek, and Carter is the one who pushed for security intervention." Calvin paced, arms crossed tightly. "That evidence destroys every single argument they've made." Jonathan felt a surge of heat run down his spine. Not yesterday's fury, something clearer. The awareness that every brick in their wall of lies was beginning to crack. Calvin spoke. "They want a battlefield. Fine. We show them what a real war looks like." Outside the window, snow still fell over Paris. But inside the hospital room, the air grew hotter with each file Calvin opened. "A contact in media sent me this," Calvin said as he rotated the laptop. It was a draft of an internal PR email. "From GlobalStar, we must establish Brooks as an unstable passenger. Focus on his angry reaction. Minimize mention of the wife's medical condition." Jonathan read every word. Each one burned through the thin layer of patience he had left. Calvin spelled it out, slow and deliberate. "They want to turn you into the irrational villain. They want to erase Linda from the story. They want to turn discrimination into a simple passenger dispute." Jonathan stood, not because of anger, not because of pain, but because he had crossed a line he would never step back behind. He looked directly at Calvin. "From now on, we hit them head on. No dodging, no waiting." For the first time, Calvin nodded without objection. "I agree. It's time." The hospital room door opened softly. Tiana stepped inside, still in her GlobalStar uniform, but the fear in her eyes was gone. "Dr. Brooks, I have something." She extended her phone, her hand trembling slightly. "This is a copy of the internal seat assignment schedule. It says directly, prioritize adjusting seats for Carter, regardless of availability." Jonathan looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days, his gaze softened. "Thank you. You know the risk, right?" Tiana nodded. "I know. But if I stay silent, I'll never forgive myself." For the first time, Jonathan realized this fight no longer sat on his shoulders alone. Others' small voices inside a giant system were rising. Calvin closed the folder, his voice firm. "They opened a front in New York." Jonathan lifted his chin. "Then we open one in Paris." Calvin looked at him, seeing the thing every lawyer recognizes in a client who has stopped being afraid. A cold resolve, a will that will not bend, a fire that knows exactly what it intends to burn down. "I'll file the lawsuit in 3 hours, Calvin said. Jonathan replied without hesitation, "Do it." In that hospital room with the monitors beeping steadily, snow falling quietly outside, and the shadow of a massive system beginning to crack, Jonathan Brooks was no longer just the man forced off a plane. He was the man GlobalStar should never have crossed. Jonathan stood by the hospital window, watching the Paris daylight reflect against the glass. The entire city seemed wrapped in silence, yet inside him, a storm was forming, spiraling fast and cold, with one clear purpose to strike directly at the system that had nearly cost Linda her life. Linda woke as the morning light filled the room. She looked at Jonathan with tired but clear eyes. "Jonathan, you were awake all night, weren't you?" He didn't answer, just gently adjusted her blanket. Linda placed her hand over his. "I can see it. I see it in your eyes. You can't stand still anymore, can you?" Jonathan squeezed her hand, his gaze lowering. "I won't stand still." "Not this time." Linda nodded faintly. Good. Don't let them turn this into a small mistake. Don't let them say I was just unwell. They forced us off that plane. They dragged you like a criminal. You have to keep going." Jonathan leaned down and kissed her forehead. And right then, the door burst open. Calvin stepped in, laptop under his arm, looking like he had just walked off a battlefield. "Jonathan, get ready. The meteor is exploding. GlobalStar just launched a new strategy, and it's dirtier than anything we predicted." Jonathan straightened. "What are they doing now?" Calvin opened the laptop and hit play. A company spokesperson appeared on screen. "We suspect Mr. Brooks intentionally exploited his wife's condition to create conflict and disrupt the flight." Jonathan clenched his hand until his knuckles went white. Calvin said, "They've shifted their entire strategy. They're not just attacking you, they're attacking Linda. They're implying she faked her condition," filthy Jonathan hissed. "Exactly," Calvin replied. "And that's not all." Another clip appeared. GlobalStar had hired a communications expert to analyze Jonathan, portraying him as aggressive, confrontational, and non-compliant from the beginning. They even fabricated a staged reenactment on a mock aircraft to illustrate his alleged behavior. Jonathan laughed, not because it was funny, but because the lies were so blatantly absurd. Calvin said they're playing the game of people with money power and media in their hands. Tiana entered, worry etched across her face, though her voice remained steady. They issued an internal notice. All flight attendants are forbidden from discussing the incident. Anyone who leaks anything will be suspended or fired. Calvin frowned. That's obstruction of an active investigation. Tiana handed him a document. "I still saved the original. This is the official email." "I know the risk." Jonathan looked at the young woman in front of him, her hands shaking slightly, though her eyes did not. He took the document gently. "Thank you. You have no idea how many people you've just helped." Tiana lowered her head, but her voice remained firm. "I'm only doing what's right. I've seen discrimination like this for too long. Everyone stays silent. I don't want to be silent anymore." Calvin flipped through the pages. His eyes widened. "Jonathan, this is gold. They exposed their entire oppressive system. Look at this." Jonathan read the documents page by page. Staff should not contradict VIP passengers, even if they violate regulations. When adjusting seats for high-paying guests, prioritize moving individuals deemed less visually suitable first. Do not include any sensitive discriminatory requests from VIPs in internal reports. Jonathan closed his eyes for several long seconds. Not to calm down, but to carve this into his heart, to turn the wound into fuel. Calvin said, "Do you understand? This is policy, not an accident." Jonathan opened his eyes. "I understand. And I'm going to tear it down," Calvin typed rapidly. "I'll use these documents to request a temporary restraining order from the court. GlobalStar will be legally forced to stop smearing you and Linda." Jonathan said, "What about Carter?" Calvin smirked. "I also got a tip from an anonymous staff member. Carter requested that the airline ensure he wouldn't sit near black passengers." Derek replied, "I'll take care of it." Jonathan stood frozen. The cold inside him shifted into a dangerous energy. "Do we have proof?" soon Calvin said. "They're looking for the recording from the check-in desk." Jonathan looked back at Linda. She was watching him, eyes full of hope. He inhaled deeply, stepped closer, and took her hand. Linda whispered, "Go. Do what you have to do." Jonathan nodded. Calvin closed the laptop with finality. "We're doing a press conference in 30 minutes, But this time he looked at Jonathan with the gaze of someone who knew exactly what was about to ignite. "You're not just speaking, you're leading." Jonathan put on his coat, buttoned it, and stepped out of the room. The hospital hallway was long, cold, and quiet, but his footsteps echoed with strength and resolve. Doctors, nurses, and patients looked up as he passed. They didn't know the full story, but they recognized the presence of a man no longer running from the fight. When Jonathan reached the main lobby, the wall of reporters was already waiting, cameras flashing like lightning, but this time he wasn't overwhelmed. He walked toward the podium the way he walked into an operating room, calm, focused, and dangerous to anyone who dared cross a line. Calvin stood beside him. Tiana stood behind him, trembling but still there. Warren appeared from the left, handing Calvin the untouched video files. Jonathan touched the microphone. The sound echoed, and the entire lobby fell silent. He did not read the prepared statement. He didn't need to. His voice rose low and sharp, cutting through the sound of clicking cameras. "My name is Jonathan Brooks, and I will not be silent anymore." The room froze. Jonathan continued not shouting, not losing control, but channeling disciplined anger. "They say I caused trouble. They say I attacked someone. They say my wife faked her condition. But the truth is this: they endangered my wife's life to satisfy a man with more money." The microphones pushed closer. Jonathan looked into the cameras as if staring straight through CEO Dawson. If they want a battle, then this is the battle. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were surgical, honed like a scalpel, sharpened to perfection. They are not just facing me. They are facing everyone who has ever been treated as unworthy of sitting in the front row. He paused for half a second that shook the entire room. Then he finished. "This fight, I guarantee, will not end until the truth brings them down." The entire lobby erupted in flashes. Jonathan stepped away from the podium. Behind him, GlobalStar had no idea that what had just begun was not a scandal. It was a revolution. Jonathan had barely stepped away from the press podium when Calvin pulled him into a quieter corner of the hallway, far from the crowd of cameras and murmuring reporters. The air still vibrated with the aftershock of Jonathan's words. Tiana stood a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly, her face, a mix of fear and resolve, the expression of someone who knew she had stepped into a storm from which there was no turning back. Calvin scrolled rapidly through his phone notifications, flashing non-stop. "Jonathan, every major news outlet has published the story in under 5 minutes. Fox, CNN, the Associated Press, Reuters, all of them." But he paused. GlobalStar responded instantly. Jonathan leaned slightly forward. "What did they do?" Calvin held up the screen. A brand new statement appeared. "GlobalStar Airlines considers Mr. Brooks's accusations baseless, malicious, and motivated by personal gain. We are working with authorities to investigate Mr. Brooks's actions, including assault and obstruction of aviation security." Jonathan read each word slowly, swallowing them like burning stones. "They're trying to criminalize me." Calvin nodded. "Exactly. It's intimidation. They want to scare you, make you believe you could be arrested." He looked Jonathan in the eyes. "But remember this. An airline cannot get a respected doctor convicted using empty statements. They're blowing smoke." Tiana stepped closer, speaking softly but urgently. "Dr. Brooks, I just heard from a friend still working today. They're forcing the flight attendants from that night to sign revised reports, pre-written statements saying you yelled, threatened, and behaved aggressively. Calvin slapped his hand against the wall, the sharp crack echoing through the hall, turning staff into shields. Classic, dirty, predictable. I knew they'd do it. Jonathan turned to Tiana. "And you did they force you to sign?" Tiana nodded faintly. "They tried. I refused. I was suspended this morning." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder, a light gesture carrying the weight of gratitude and respect. "You did something not everyone has the courage to do." Tiana shook her head. "No, Dr. Brooks. I just did what was right. If I stayed silent, I'd be part of what hurt your wife." Calvin opened his laptop right on the hallway bench. "Listen, we strike back right away. I've drafted an emergency motion for the Paris court demanding GlobalStar stop destroying evidence, coercing employees, and spreading false narratives." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "They'll fight it." Calvin responded without hesitation. "Good." He looked up at Jonathan with crisp, deliberate emphasis. "Because the harder they fight, the more they reveal." Jonathan felt a wave of heat pass through him, not anger, but strategic clarity. He understood GlobalStar was operating on survival instinct, and when powerful institutions begin to panic, they stumble over their own weapons. A new alert flashed on the hallway television. Jonathan and Calvin looked up. CEO Edward Dawson calls emergency meeting with head of communications and legal. Calvin let out a cold smile. He's bleeding internally. Jonathan asked quietly, "Calvin, when does this end?" Calvin snapped his laptop, shut the sound, sharp and final. "When we drag every piece of truth into the light, when we pull out the evidence, when we bring out the witnesses, when we force the entire system to stand before justice." Jonathan stared out the glass toward Paris, his voice low and steady like a river at night. "They think they're fighting a passenger. They're wrong." Calvin replied, "Very wrong." And in that moment, none of them spoke further. They didn't need to. All three, Jonathan, Calvin, and Tiana, felt the shift forming in the air, the kind that signals a confrontation, no longer between people, but between a man who refuses to bow and a system that must kneel before the truth. Jonathan stood before the Paris courthouse in the biting morning cold. The grey stone steps stretched out beneath him like a battlefield waiting for its first footfall. Below, dozens of reporters crowded together, microphones raised high, but none of the noise reached Jonathan. He heard only his heartbeat, heavy, steady, resolute. Calvin walked beside him, carrying a thick stack of files. "Today is the first hearing," he said, voice calm, but eyes sharp as a surgical blade. "GlobalStar will try to delay, try to claim the case isn't serious enough to enter trial. But we have everything we need." Jonathan nodded slightly. "They won't throw me out of this courtroom the way they threw me off that plane." Inside, the air felt dense, almost solid. GlobalStar's lawyers sat in a long row, suits immaculate faces, expressionless eyes calculating. In the center sat CEO Dawson. His face revealed nothing but his hands, fingers pressed tightly together, betrayed tension he was trying to hide. Jonathan looked directly at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with the certainty of someone holding the truth. When the judge entered, everyone rose. A brief moment of compressed silence filled the room. Calvin spoke first. "Your Honor, this is not a simple seating dispute. This is systemic discrimination, the abuse of power by an entire structure that caused a woman to be hospitalized after being denied proper care. This is not an accident. This is architecture." GlobalStar's attorney stood voice strained, despite the attempt to sound firm. "Mr. Brooks overreacted. but the judge lifted a hand, cutting him off instantly. I have seen the viral video. I have also reviewed the original security report submitted by the plaintiff, and I see numerous inconsistencies between your company's statements and what actually occurred. Dawson's shoulder twitched. Jonathan noticed. He knew he was witnessing the first fracture in their fortress. Calvin presented the USB drive, the internal audio recordings. The judge listened to every line. Someone like that, move them down. Prioritize Carter regardless. Each sentence slammed into the heavy wooden desk like a hammer blow. The judge set the USB down and looked directly at the GlobalStar team. If what is heard in this recording is genuine, your company does not merely have a problem. Your company has a moral crisis. Jonathan did not blink. He listened, but it felt as though justice itself was speaking for Linda, and for all those who had been pushed out of first class because they did not fit the image. At the end of the session, the judge announced, "This case will proceed to full trial, and I order GlobalStar to submit all airport camera footage within 72 hours. Calvin turned to Jonathan and nodded. "We just won the first battle." Jonathan looked toward the courthouse doors as snow began to fall. He closed his hand into a fist, his voice low and solid as stone. "Not just the first battle. This entire war, I will see it through to the end." From an expert's perspective, Jonathan's story shows that injustice is never just the action of an individual. It is the product of an entire system that must be examined all the way to its roots. Those who dare to stand up do not only change their own fate, they reshape the very structure in which power operates. If you believe the truth deserves to be protected, please like, subscribe, and comment the phrase "Stand Up."